Hey, welcome back to Album Club. I'm Bob Santelli from the GRAMMY Museum, your host. And for those of you who are joining for the first time, very quickly, let me tell you what Album Club is all about. It's kind of like a book club, except we're listening to some of the landmark albums of our time. We actually began last week with Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA from 1984. This week, what we'll do is step back in time, back to the early 1970s, and we'll deal with an album that came out of Jamaica and really changed the course of popular music in the 1970s. I'm talking about the Wailers' Catch a Fire. Now, before we get into Catch a Fire a little bit, let me just tell you how this thing works. The album club is really broken down into two segments. Segment one, this one here, I'll give you a little bit of an idea as to how the album came about, some listening points for the album, some things to think about as you are doing your homework during the next week and listening to Catch a Fire either on CD or vinyl or perhaps streaming it. And then we come back next week and we discuss in detail some really critical tracks. The hope is that by the end of the two segments, you have a greater understanding of the album, you have a greater appreciation of the group Bob Marley and the Wailers, and you are able to basically include this into your regular listening list because it's such an album of great importance. All the albums that we'll be talking about in Album Club are important, but this one in particular is really important, and here's why. So in 1973, when this record came out, first of all, you probably say, well, you called them Bob Marley and the Wailers. Well, technically speaking, Bob Marley and the Wailers did not exist yet. The group was called the Wailers. It'll be only later on that the group will change its name to Bob Marley and the Wailers. The Wailers were one of the most important reggae groups out of Jamaica, and they had released a number of recordings in Jamaica for the previous decade. They had released local versions of some of the songs that would actually see the light of day on Catch a Fire, but they never had international distribution. They didn't have the ability to get those records beyond the island, which is what they really wanted to do. The three critical people in the Wailers at the time, certainly the great Bob Marley, also Peter Tosh, and Bunny Livingston, also known as Bunny Wailer. So what they did essentially was they went to someone who had become a real important person in popular music in the late 60s and early 70s, who also was Jamaican. His name was Chris Blackwell. Chris Blackwell owned Island Records, which operated primarily out of the UK. So the Wailers went to the UK to talk to Chris Blackwell about signing with his label and releasing a full album's worth of material that would be available in the UK, in the US, around the world actually. Blackwell was intrigued with Marley and the others and gave them some money to go and make a record. Now it's kind of interesting because on numerous occasions, I've spoken to Chris Blackwell, who's become a good friend of the GRAMMY Museums, actually, about this seminal moment, not only in Island Records history, but also in reggae history. And he said that rather than assign a reputable or seasoned or veteran producer to go with the Wailers back to Jamaica and make this record, he really felt strongly that Marley and Tosh and Bunny Livingston should be able to do it themselves and had the capacity to do it. That took great trust from someone who basically had signed groups like Traffic and Jimmy Cliff. He knew another great Jamaican artist and others that he was involved in. To let someone like the Wailers go back and make a record on their own. Now, he didn't pay him a whole lot of money. If memory serves me well, he paid him about 4,000 British pounds. Back then, hardly any money, but it didn't cost that much to make a record in Jamaica back then. Anyway, what happens is Marley, Tosh, and Bunny go back to Jamaica, and in a short period of time, in the fall of 1972, they go into the studio and they cut 9 classic tracks that ultimately would make up the album Catch a Fire. It might be argued that Catch a Fire is the first true reggae album. And the reason why I say that is because let me just give you a short history of what reggae music was all about. In 1962, Jamaica gains its independence from the UK. And that begins a whole period of self-identity and looking inward to create a culture that's uniquely Jamaican. And one of the things they do, of course, is they go to music, as many Caribbean nations are so connected to their musical experiences. And so something called ska is the first great music form to come out of Jamaica in the 1960s. That would give way to rocksteady, a slower version, if you will, of ska with a little bit more emphasis on the bottom or bass. And that, by the late 1960s, would give way to something that we would call reggae. Most people outside of Jamaica didn't know what reggae was, didn't even know what rocksteady was or ska, unless you happened to be a cruise ship musician, which frequented the ports of Jamaica, or a tourist down into Jamaica, or a emigrant from Jamaica to London or to New York in particular, where a lot of Jamaicans had relocated after independence. Anyway, the Wailers are a group that basically starts in ska, moves into rocksteady, but really embraces this new reggae sound, which is basically an even slower, even sexier version of what rocksteady is, with a thicker, harder beat and bass and a kind of chica kind of guitar sound that gave it such a unique sound and such a unique sensibility. So when Chris Blackwell, who had been familiar with all of this, decides to take a chance to try and create a demand for reggae beyond the island of Jamaica, he picks the right group. Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, Bunny Wailer, or Bunny Livingston had been students of American music throughout the 1960s. They loved groups like the Impressions and the Temptations. They heard music coming out of Miami and New Orleans, and basically incorporated a lot of American soul and rhythm and blues elements into their music. They all could sing. They had great harmonies and a great understanding of what a unique sound should be like coming out of Jamaica. They go into the studio, they cut these 9 tracks, and what's really interesting for me, and what's something that you should pay attention to when you revisit this album, is this. Catch a Fire is not just a reggae album, it's a revolutionary album, it's a political album. There are tracks on it such as Concrete Jungle and Slave Driver and 400 Years, 3 really important tracks, not just to Catch a Fire, but to reggae in general, that carried on the revolutionary fervor that was incorporated into late 60s rock and roll, but by the early 1970s had begun to dissipate, and the idea of creating music as an agent for social and political protests in the US had started to diminish. What was picked up by Marley and the Wailers, who felt as young Rastafarians, meaning Rastafarian being not just a form of religion, but also a natural philosophy. And one of the things they did, of course, was grow their hair, as in dreadlocks. They were basically being singled out by the establishment and by the police in Jamaica. So they felt a need to express their frustration and anger about this oppression in their music. And that's what they do. So those 9 tracks, including a couple of them that they had originally recorded back in the mid-1960s in Jamaica on Just Jamaica Recordings, a song like Stir It Up, which becomes a standard, right? These songs carry a potent revolutionary political fervor that was really missing by 1973 in a lot of rock and roll, and would not surface again until groups like the Sex Pistols and Clash and others would bring together in the mid-1970s reggae and punk, particularly in the UK, to form yet another version of rock and roll, political rock and roll, if you will. So in 1973, this record comes out, and it doesn't sell all that well, but the critics and a lot of musicians really, really pick up on it. Chris Blackwell puts the group on tour, and I've always said one of the great concerts that I would give anything to have been at occurred in 1973 in New York City at a club called Max's Kansas City, because on that bill were 2 of the most important people in my life, musically speaking, and also 2 of the most important artists of the 1970s and beyond. Bruce Springsteen, and Bob Marley. Can you imagine a bill that had the Wailers with Bob Marley and Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band playing in a little club in New York City? Hardly anyone there, but basically this was a sign, a musical sign of things to come for the rest of the decade. 1975, Springsteen would release Born to Run. And of course, after Catch a Fire comes a string of 5-star classic, not just reggae albums, but Bob Marley and the Wailer albums that basically would change music around the world. Marley would become the international superstar, the man, the common man that people in third world countries could absolutely relate to, in particular because of the political inclinations of his music. So when you go back to your music and back to Catch a Fire, between this segment and the next segment we'll do next week, pay attention to the following tracks. 2 of them, again, will deal with serious African and Caribbean oppression. Number 1, 400 Years. Number 2, Slave Driver. Pay attention to Concrete Jungle, another track that really digs deep into how music can act as an agent for change. Concrete Jungle obviously being the city, and basically they're talking about the biggest, most important city in Jamaica, actually in the Caribbean at the time, Kingston, which is where reggae would first surface in the late 1960s. Listen to those 3 tracks in particular, and then listen to the classic Stir It Up, which will become, as I said before, a staple in Bob Marley's set, and considered today one of the greatest reggae tracks of all time. Listen to the entire album, of course, and then next time when we meet, we'll go through each of those 4 tracks, talk about them in detail, and I'm hoping to get on the phone for us Chris Blackwell to talk a little bit about how this particular record was made and his feelings on it now, almost 50 years from the date that it actually came out. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, stay safe, stay well. As you know, one of the reasons why we're doing this album club is to basically give you something to do during these long hours where we're pretty much stuck at home. But the music is also meant to be a form of inspiration for you as well. So listening to great music definitely can change your mood, it can change your outlook on things. And if there's one record that can do that, in my opinion, it's the Wailers' Catch a Fire. So until then, I'll see you. Let your friends know about Album Club, and I'll check you out on the other side of next week. Thanks for listening.